these Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti, and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and today I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation about the Detroit Partnership and stepping through the Prohibition Era. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to the Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Let's begin with a brief, bloody recap of our last episode. After Tony and Sam Genoa had wrangled control out of the hands of the very old-school men of honor who had previously run the city, by 1913-1914, the brothers controlled the city without much contest. The structure was set up so that Tony Genoa was the boss and Salvatore Genoa was the underboss. Tony Genoa's top lieutenant and close friend was Pietro Bosco, an extremely violent man from Castellammare del Tocco who helped the Genoas expand their mafia beyond the influence of their fellow immigrants from Terracini. In addition to that, Bosco was a shrewd businessman who would do something for which the Detroit Partnership would soon become famous. He diversified his businesses. While murder and the illegal car trade were his top illegal activities, Bosco was also a successful grocer and meat distributor. Bosco did get into trouble with the law in 1917 for car theft. The investigation had been run by Detective Emmanuel Rogers, who would be murdered that same year on July 24, 1917. No one has ever been charged. Besides the Genoas themselves, it is believed that Bosco was the wealthiest mobster in all of Detroit, and this did not sit well with Tony Genoa. Soon, Genoa and Bosco were fighting, with Genoa believing that Bosco was planning a takeover. Later evidence would suggest that Genoa's suspicions were right, as Bosco, with the quiet support of his top man, Genoa-Vitale, had in fact been plotting a coup. This would lead to Bosco's murder on October 8, 1918, on Genoa orders. This murder split the family apart and began the year-long Genoa-Bosco War. Tony Genoa would be murdered on January 3, 1919, by the order from the Bosco faction, now under the control of Genoa-Vitale. After Tony's death, the Genoas were now controlled by Salvatore. Salvatore Genoa was almost murdered in a shooting in February of 1919 that took the life of his brother-in-law. During his brother-in-law's funeral, Genoa ordered that one of Vitale's businesses be shot up. When police came to investigate, Vitale shot at officers, mistakenly thinking that they were more Genoa men. Vitale would then be arrested and taken to jail. While in jail, Vitale had arranged for 3 visitors to come and see him on February 26, 1919. Vito Renda, Salvatore Vola, and his son Giuseppe Vitale. When these visitors arrived, 2 Genoa men opened fire on them. Giuseppe Vitale and Salvatore Vola were injured, but Vito Renda received over 20 gunshot wounds and died from his injuries. Before his passing, he identified Salvatore Genoa as his shooter. Salvatore Genoa was in the process of exiting the city of Detroit to instead focus on building a macaroni factory in Cincinnati, Ohio, but he never got the chance. While exiting the bank on October 2, 1919, his body was filled with over 24 assassin's bullets, and he died, leaving control of Detroit to Genoa-Vitale. And Vitale would end up being a terrible boss. It was the very beginning of the Prohibition Era, and mobsters were flooding into the city to make their fortunes in Detroit, which is right on the Canadian border, by way of illegally smuggling booze from the United States neighbor to the north. There was much more money to be made, and a very bitter set of Genoa loyalists and the opportunistic mobsters who rose up to join them from Detroit's East Side, Little Sicily. Vitale would order the hit on East Side leader Giuseppe Manzello that was carried out in the summer of 1920, and this murder just strengthened the Genoa loyalist resolve. Vitale refused to leave his house for fear of the East Siders. On October 18, 1920, Vitale and his son Giuseppe were targeted for an attack when Giuseppe came to pick up his father. Giuseppe Vitale was shot and killed, but John Vitale survived. On September 28, 1920, John Vitale would be murdered. Many believe this murder was carried out by his most trusted bodyguard Andrea Liccato, the primary suspect in the murder of Detective Rogers. Vitale's murder remains unsolved, and Liccato himself would be shot and killed by mid-October. This left a power vacuum that was filled by the East Siders, specifically Angelo Melli, who became the de facto boss since he was the most powerful on the East Side. Melli's focus would be on consolidation of the various Detroit factions. And that's where we're going to pick up our conversation today. If those details are a little fuzzy or confusing to you, or you just want a more in-depth review, make sure to check out the previous videos on Detroit's origin, but as for today, let's keep moving forward. It is under Angelo Melli that we really begin to see the Sicilian Mafia in Detroit begin to mix mobsters from various Sicilian regions. Melli himself was from San Cataldo, right in the middle of Sicily as opposed to the usual coastal and/or northwest regions. Angelo Melli teamed up with several men, including Giuseppe Joseph or Joe Cerilli, Guglielmo William Tocco, Pietro Peter Licavoli, and Giovanni Papa John Prizziola. These men, along with Melli himself, would be the basis for the Council of Five that would soon control Detroit by the mid-1930s and remain in power for more than 40 years. But not yet, that will come later. Melli also teamed up with two other men to make this coalition work, Salvatore Catalanotte and Cesare Chester Lamari. Catalanotte was critical in Detroit's unification. Once Angelo Melli got the gang together, it is believed that Salvatore Catalanotte made the partnership actually work together, specifically in regard to settling the feuds between the former rivals in the Genoa-Vitale fighting. Catalanotte was a former Genoa bootlegger and had survived many attempts on his life by Vitale rivals. As head of the Detroit faction of the Unione Siciliana, he was critical in convincing his fellow Genoa loyalists that working together with the Vitale loyalists would be worth their while. Catalanotte established the territories for the two factions and the guidelines by which they were to work together. His decision to allow the Genoa and Vitale loyalists to maintain their separate factions and territories was a stroke of genius, because it did not require them to work hand in hand. His only expectation was cooperation. This was known as the Pascuzzi Combine, and consisted of Genoa loyalists, Vitale loyalists, members of the Unione Siciliana, and the river gang that was headed by the Licavoli brothers, Thomas and Peter. Peter would go on to be one of the partnership's Council of Five. Licavoli and Catalanotte worked very closely with one another in the smuggling of liquor into Detroit from Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Catalanotte would be the man responsible for convincing the warring factions that it would be in their best interest to focus on corrupting city and state leaders instead of killing each other. Catalanotte was a visionary and critical to the development of what became the Detroit Partnership. This was done, frankly, by means of join or die. The money to be made from Prohibition was enough to cool many of the vendettas that had been accumulated by the warring factions. And for those whose vengeance could not be purchased by the lucrative promise of Prohibition, well, they were simply removed from the board, in true Mafia fashion. By 1921, the mantle of Detroit boss was in the possession of Salvatore Catalanotte. He was respected, intelligent, influential, and certainly peaceful by comparison to Vitale. The operations of the Combine ran fairly smoothly until federal agents conducted several raids in 1929, which wound up dismantling the Pascuzzi Combine, but Catalanotte's Combine was extremely resilient and would hold on another year before descending back into its old habits. Perhaps it would have lasted longer if Catalanotte had survived. Catalanotte ran Detroit's underworld for 9 years and was the first boss to die of natural causes instead of being killed or forced out of power. Salvatore Catalanotte died from complications from influenza and pneumonia on Valentine's Day, his birthday, in 1930. His February 14, 1930 death marked the end of the unnatural 9-year peace that had settled the city. At Catalanotte's funeral, all major members of Detroit's underworld attended and paid their respects. Gaspare Milazzo was an immigrant from Castellammare del Golfo, a commander under Angelo Melli and a close ally to Salvatore Catalanotte. Milazzo had moved all around the country, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and California, working for various mobsters before settling in Detroit and running an illegal brewery outside the back of his grocery store by the 1920s. Milazzo is often reported to have become the leader following Catalanotte's death, but Milazzo's time as boss was so brief it is often overlooked or skipped altogether, as he himself would die within about 3 months of Catalanotte's death. In order for us to understand what happened with Milazzo, you and I are going to have to get in our Wayback Machine and go all the way back to our episodes about New York City and the Castellammare War. From 1930 to 1931, the Castellammare Mafia War tore New York City to pieces. This battle was fought primarily between two factions, Joe Mazzaria, who became boss of bosses in 1928, versus Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano had inherited his headship of his family from Niccolo Schiro, under whom Milazzo had been employed, making Milazzo one of the many enemies of Joe Mazzaria. To make matters more complicated, Chester Lamari, although aligned with Catalanotte and Melli's peace efforts in Detroit, had become a strong ally of Joe Mazzaria by the latter half of the 1920s. When Mazzaria became boss of bosses in 1928, he knew that his inroads into Detroit would not be strong if there was any loyalty to Maranzano. Mazzaria encouraged Lamari to take out Sam Perino, Milazzo's colleague, Gaspare Milazzo, who was aligned with Schiro and thus aligned with Maranzano, and Angelo Melli, who was aligned with Milazzo, thus Schiro, thus Maranzano. To put it as plainly as I can, Melli, Perino, and Milazzo made up the Detroit faction of the Maranzano side, while Lamare represented Mazzaria's interests in the city. Although Lamare was still technically part of Melli's coalition, which included Joe Cerilli, William Tocco, Peter Licavoli, and Papa John Prizziola, they all knew that Lamare was no longer trustworthy, and soon he would prove his untrustworthiness beyond a shadow of a doubt. Upon Mazaria's suggestion, Lamare ordered the hit on Mele, Perino, and Milazzo, which was carried out on May 31st, 1930, when Lamare ordered a regional meeting of Detroit mobsters to the fish market on East Verner Highway. At this meeting, Lamare gunmen awaited the Maranzano loyalists with shotguns. Milazzo died immediately from his shotgun injuries at close range. Perino would ultimately die from his injuries, but lived long enough to lie to police and say he did not recognize the gunmen and had no idea why anyone would want to shoot them. He would be rushed to receiving hospital, where he would die at 2:30 in the afternoon. Angelo Mele was smart enough to opt into skipping this meeting. When he heard about the deaths of his friends, he began plotting the murder of Lamare. In the meantime, Lamare became the boss of Detroit with Mazaria's endorsement. The fish market murders, as they came to be known, made Lamare one of the most hated men in the Detroit underworld, despite his illustrious title and endorsement. By 1930, Detroit was so dangerous for Lamare that it's reported he moved to New York City for a few months just to get out of the crosshairs. Chester Lamare would return to his home in Detroit in early February. The Detroit police were aware of his return and had already prepared a raid on his home on February 7, 1930. Sadly for the police, they were never able to bring Lamare to justice. The night before, or the very day of, while his wife was out, Lamare had received a guest into his home, and apparently this guest was a friend, because there's no way that Lamare, being public enemy #1 in the underworld, was going to let just anybody in his home. This guest would soon terminate their friendship by firing 2 bullets into Lamare's skull and killing him. For this murder, Joseph Cerilli and William Tocco were both brought into custody after being arrested, but there was never enough evidence to make a case against them, and they were let go. Following the death of Lamare, Detroit would enter another period of peace that was marked by the coming together of the East Side, former Genoa, and West Side, former Vitale gangs. At this point, Joseph Cerilli and William Black Bill Tocco would take over as bosses of what is the true beginning of the modern Detroit partnership. Salvatore Catalanotte's vision with the Pascuzzi Combine had been ahead of its time and not fully realized until the Cerilli-Tocco era. By most evidence, it appears that Tocco took on the technical title of boss for about 5 years before opting into the position of underboss beneath Cerilli, but the truth is that they were close friends and co-bosses for nearly all of their tenure, which will be the topic of our next episode. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews, stepping through Detroit's bloody Prohibition history. Despite Catalanotte's best efforts, the wild city of Detroit would not be bridled until the Tocco-Cerilli era, and even then, as you'll see in our next episode, it was no picnic. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about the Detroit Mafia. Also, don't forget to let me know in the comment section or social media who or what you would like to see covered next. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your soapbox. Ciao!